Our conference here is through Tinted lenses, and I think it's really appropriate that our final panel is on film, because film and television really are through a lens, and it's only through a lens, and as we have seen in some of the fabulous presentations on this panel, that you get a certain picture. So the lens can represent not only the actual physical lens, but the particular kinds of technologies that you use when you're framing and cutting and juxtaposing images together, and these things all contribute to the meaning. We've certainly seen that there's no monopoly on misunderstanding. That is ubiquitous across the globe. There's also no monopoly on putting one's own culture, group, or country in a negative or in a positive light by means of showing the other in a negative light, and we've seen that as well. These non-narrative aspects of film that I just referred to, the lighting, sound, formatting, framing, the distance, the juxtaposition, and so on, these are all there, but most of us, I think, watch film. As we watch film, we try to form a coherent narrative. And the technical aspects can be very important in this narrative formation, but also literary aspects such as the story, the character, the dialogue, and the plot, the references, the cultural references are also part of this story. So what I'm going to try to do today is to try to contextualize this kind of representation of culture a little bit that our presenters talked about and referred to and are actually engaged in at a creative level within some questions about how we think about culture and how we represent culture, and how difficult it really is to grasp onto what culture really is. We've heard a lot in the conference about this kind of narrative formation, often called misunderstanding. But let's face it, is there anything other than misunderstanding? It's very hard. In fact, think of the smallest group, you and your family. I mean, you cannot get beyond misunderstanding. What these really are, of course, is different ways of looking at the world, different perspectives and different desires. So understanding was only going to get you so far. At some time you're into negotiation, you're into trying to convince others that your position is reasonable, and so on. One thing that I was struck in listening to our presenters is, in addition to this complexity of narrative formation, there's also the simple impact of the image. This is kind of close to advertising in a way, and I think Stan Rosen brought this out in his series of clips, which is that a film can project a damning ideological message, but if the image is attractive, a curious person, an optimistic demeanor, a lively intellect, an adventurous spirit, all of these can really work against the overt ideology of the film to engender an interest in this so-called cultural representative. We saw that with Zhi Xiao's representation of Owen, supposedly doing a lot of bad things in China, but actually a really interesting character. Perhaps we can call this the Putin effect, because you have this kind of almost, amazingly powerful images that cannot be controlled entirely by the filmmaker or the artist who puts them out there. Certainly the same is true within a culture. If we look at Sui Wei's 1959 Song of Youth, for example, which featured the conversion of an attractive young woman named Lin Daojing from a bourgeois pleasure perspective to a perspective of the revolution. The image of Lin standing in her white scarf standing against the sky was so powerful that it was actually picked up as an image of a bourgeois person. So you see this image repeated all over the place. Yet when Jiang Wen made his 1994 film In the Heat of the Sun, he picked this image up. And what this film really does is absolutely discount revolutionary ideology, but instead shifts the focus to the sensual implications of revolutionary passion. 5 minutes, but you counted the first 2 minutes, so that's been so you have a twisting, a kind of twisting of the message there. And I think that film and any other kind of cultural representation, especially that of the other, but even in your own culture, is slippery. It brings in the uncanny. And so strive as any film or TV show made to project a certain perspective. To be convincing, it has to represent the attraction of what it is trying to oppose. So it's inherently kind of contradictory, slippery, and hard to control. I think that we saw that in many of the clips that we saw, and many of our discussants talk about it. If you look at what Sherwood is doing also, you see someone on kind of on the cutting edge, like, I'm going to try to figure out how to represent something in a complex way without sort of fixing it in time. And cultural representation, of course, then becomes quite difficult, quite treacherous, quite hard, and with opening many possibilities. But let's say you do, like as Sherwood is doing, you want to go out there and do something, you want to create in the area of culture. What is culture? I mean, what really is it? I think it's very thorny to define it, and I think that the clips that he showed us are really interesting in that we can identify sort of different kinds of culture. And one of these kinds of culture is specific cultural forms and traditions. So we can identify certain Chinese forms of food, of dance, of music, American forms of dance, music, architecture, literature, language, even intellectual traditions such as Confucianism, for example, we can identify these. But when you try to grab these things and these specific cultural forms and represent them in film, as we saw from the clip of the 2008 Olympics, and its spoof within, was it Family Guy?
South Park.
South Park. Oh, the spoof within South Park, okay. Those things actually are hard to represent because they can come across as very stale. And that's why Zhang Yimou's 2008 opening and closing ceremonies for the Olympics were criticized by intellectuals because they said, you know, here we've got it, gunpowder, printing, paper, and the compass. Excuse me, China has a forward-looking culture as well. It doesn't just have a backward-looking culture. So the second kind of culture, which is a little more complicated and nuanced, is something that I just call the way we live, basically the way we live. And it refers to a kind of the way that knowledge is organized in a specific culture, the institutional bases, the schools that we use, our kin relations, gender roles, positions, the way we experience time and space, fast, slow, you know, however, the way we learn things, and how all of this fits together in a certain logic of culture that forms a coherent world for us. Of course, there's problems in defining culture because, as we know, all cultures change over time. So you would try to fix something as essentially Chinese, you get into trouble because China's already moved on and changed. It's also, another difficulty is that it's really impossible to determine authenticity because cultural authenticity turns out to be something that, you know, goes back to a hybrid, usually a hybrid culture, almost always a hybrid culture. An example is that the identification of the Chinese dress with the high collar, which was really a Manchu form. It wasn't even a Han Chinese form. And the third problem with that is that we're all a little bit wary of cultural essentialism. We're all worried that, you know, it could be part of nationalism, kind of extreme nationalism. So you put forward a cultural banner, and that banner gets picked up as something that where you don't really want to see the kind of closed-mindedness that arrives from it. So I only have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to skip a little bit on this, but I'm going to go to the end and just talk about what capitalist modernity is doing to culture. I think that capitalist modernity, as we've heard through many of the talks in this conference, has a certain set of accompanying standards that demand universalization. So the new global kind of global form or globalization means that we have to have certain legal institutions, and countries that don't have those will find themselves under pressure if they want to participate in international business. There need to be a recognizable set of practices in each country. We've heard reference to that. Americans will not do business in the same way if it means giving bribes. We've heard about the ability to communicate efficiently, and that's what's driving the global language of English. Can there be another one? Maybe, don't know. Education must be transferable to some degree, and goods must travel. There's models, in other words, models of freedom, models of democracy, equality, individualism. We saw the Chinese kid fighting against his father here. There's all models that have a lot of pressure on various countries in the globe. There's continual pressure on local cultures to adapt. The more powerful countries, therefore, have the ability to set standards, and their local culture becomes the norm. Or rather, it becomes culture-free, and other cultures have a certain kind of ethnic culture, but the ubiquity and the universality of the most powerful culture then becomes the air that we breathe. So you can see that this brings up a lot of problems in representing culture, whether you're representing the other or yourself. Because images of the other are very, very important. They're slippery, they're difficult. My time is up. We see that I was struck by the images that Sherwood showed of some of them locked in the past and some of them way out in the future, imagining a future. And as you have to struggle with these kinds of images, I think if you're a filmmaker, if you're a television producer, if you're anyone producing culture, you have to decide what it is that you think culture is and how you're going to represent it. And I think our panelists showed us this history over time, both from the perspective of Americans trying to represent Chinese and Chinese trying to represent Americans. And obviously we can transcend these two countries as well. Thank you.